What if a simple object held the key to unlocking decades-old secrets? Stephen, a hard-working veteran, carried a mysterious pocket watch linked to his grandmother's past. But when he walked into Ellie's antique shop, he uncovered far more than he bargained for. Why does this relic connect their families, and will Stephen find the strength to move forward? The bell above the door jingled faintly as Stephen Brown stepped into Grant's Antiques, his boots scraping against the uneven wooden floorboards. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. Dusty books, brass knickknacks, and faded photographs lined every surface. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting shadows across the cluttered shop. For a moment, Stephen hesitated, his fingers tightening around the small velvet pouch tucked into his coat pocket. He hadn't wanted to come here, but desperation had a way of erasing pride. Behind the counter stood Ellie Grant, her sharp eyes flicking up from the ledger she'd been perusing. Her chestnut hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back into a neat bun, and her hands, though marked by time, moved with practiced precision as she adjusted her glasses. She exuded an air of quiet authority, her presence both welcoming and commanding. Her gaze lingered on him for a second too long, taking in his worn jacket, the slight stoop of his shoulders, and the unmistakable posture of someone who'd spent years standing at attention. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm yet tinged with curiosity, as if she'd seen enough of life to know when someone was carrying more than they let on. Stephen cleared his throat, stepping closer to the counter. "I'm looking to sell something," he said, his voice low and deliberate. He pulled the pouch from his pocket and placed it on the counter between them, his hands still resting on it as if reluctant to let go. Ellie arched an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Let me take a look at it," she said gently, gesturing for him to place the item on the counter. "Every object has a story, you know. I'd like to hear yours." With a deep breath, Stephen opened the pouch and tipped its contents onto the counter. A silver pocket watch slid out, its surface dulled by time but still bearing traces of its former elegance. Intricate engravings adorned the edges, and though the glass face was scratched, it gleamed faintly under the dim light. Ellie reached for it, her movements careful, almost reverent. She flipped it over, examining the details before opening the lid. Inside, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "For AB, Love HG." Her brow furrowed slightly as she looked up at him. "This is quite old. Where did you get it?" "It belonged to my grandmother," Stephen replied, his jaw tightening. "Amelia Brown. It's been in our family for years." Ellie's expression softened, though her eyes remained probing. "And now you want to sell it?" "I need the money," he admitted, his voice clipped. "Rent's due, and I don't have much else left to pawn." She studied him for a moment longer, noting the tension in his frame and the way his hands hovered protectively near the watch. There was more to this story, she could tell, but pressing too hard might drive him away. Instead, she focused on the object itself, turning it over in her hands. "This isn't just any watch," she murmured. "It's valuable not just monetarily, but historically. Do you know anything about its origins? Who HG might be?" Stephen shook his head. "My grandmother never talked much about her past. All I know is that she was a nurse during World War II. After the war, she came home, married my grandfather, and lived quietly until she passed. This watch stayed with her all those years." Ellie nodded slowly, her mind racing. Something about the name Amelia Brown tugged at the edges of her memory, though she couldn't quite place why. Still, she sensed that Stephen wasn't ready to part with the watch. Not entirely. Maybe he didn't even realize how deeply connected he was to it. "I'll give you a fair price," she said finally, setting the watch down gently. "But are you sure this is what you want to do? Pieces like this, they carry stories. Once they're gone, you can't get them back." Stephen exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have much choice," he muttered. "It's not like I've got anyone to leave it to anyway." Ellie frowned, sensing the weight behind his words. There was pain there, buried beneath layers of stoicism. She considered pressing further, but instead, she leaned back against the counter, folding her arms. What if I told you I might not buy it today, but I could offer you something else? I could use some help at the store, and I saw how you helped that girl outside with her bike. You look like someone who knows their way around repairs. My father used to restore antiques before he passed, and I've been meaning to fix some of the pieces gathering dust in the storeroom. Stephen's guard slipped, surprise flashing across his face. You'd hire me? Just like that? I'd call it a trade, Ellie corrected, her lips curving into a faint smile. You help me with the restoration work, and we'll revisit the topic of the watch later. No strings attached. He hesitated, glancing down at the watch lying between them. It felt wrong to leave it behind, yet the idea of walking away empty-handed seemed impossible. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded. All right, he said quietly, but only until I figure things out. Ellie extended her hand, sealing the agreement with a firm shake. As Stephen followed her to the storeroom, neither of them noticed the subtle shift in the air, the sense that this decision would set into motion events neither could have anticipated. Ellie led Stephen through the narrow aisles of Grant's Antiques, weaving past towering shelves stacked with forgotten treasures. The storeroom at the back of the shop was even more cluttered, its dim light revealing boxes overflowing with yellowed letters, tarnished silverware, and framed photographs leaning precariously against one another. Dust motes floated lazily in the air as she knelt beside a stack of crates, rummaging through their contents. Your grandmother, Amelia Brown, Ellie said, her voice thoughtful as she pulled out a large, weathered box. You said she was a nurse during World War II? Stephen leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression guarded. Yeah, she didn't talk about it much, though. Just bits and pieces when I was younger. Said it wasn't something she liked to remember. Ellie nodded thoughtfully, her fingers brushing over the lid of the box. I've kept these for decades, she murmured, opening it carefully. They're pieces of my father's life and mine in a way. Her fingers paused over one particular bundle, a collection of sepia-toned snapshots, and she carefully untied the ribbon holding them together. I think you should see this, she murmured, pulling out a photograph and handing it to him. Stephen took it hesitantly, his brow furrowing as he studied the image. It showed a group of soldiers seated on cots in what appeared to be a makeshift hospital ward. Their uniforms were worn, faces gaunt but determined. In the background stood several nurses, their crisp white uniforms stark against the drab surroundings. And then his gaze landed on one figure in particular, a young woman with soft features and a kind smile that was unmistakably familiar. That's her, he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. That's my grandmother. Ellie watched him closely, her own emotions swirling beneath the surface. She pointed to another figure in the photo, a man sitting upright on a cot, his arm in a sling. His uniform bore the insignia of an officer, and his face held a mix of exhaustion and quiet gratitude. That's my father, Ellie said softly, her gaze lingering on the photograph. Henry Grant. He was wounded in battle, shrapnel to the shoulder. Your grandmother. She stayed by his side for weeks, nursing him back to health. I grew up hearing bits and pieces of their story, though he never spoke of it openly. But I always knew it meant something profound to him. Stephen stared at the photo, his mind racing. This connection between their families, it felt surreal, almost too perfect to be coincidence. Yet there they were, frozen in time, two strangers whose lives had briefly intersected decades ago. She never mentioned him, Stephen said after a long pause, his voice rough with disbelief. Ellie shrugged, though her eyes betrayed her curiosity. Perhaps it wasn't something she wanted to share, or it was too painful to speak of. People carry secrets, especially from wars like that. Ellie paused, her expression thoughtful. But look at them. The way they're positioned, it's not just gratitude. It's connection, a bond that transcends time. I've lived long enough to recognize it when I see it. Stephen glanced back at the photo, noticing the subtle tilt of Henry's head toward Amelia. There was no mistaking the warmth in his gaze, or the faint hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Whatever had passed between them, it hadn't been purely professional. You think they were involved? Stephen asked, his tone skeptical yet tinged with intrigue. I don't know, Ellie admitted. My father never talked about it explicitly, but sometimes, when he spoke of the war, there was this wistful note in his voice, like he was remembering something or someone he'd lost. Maybe your grandmother meant more to him than just a nurse who patched him up. The room fell silent except for the faint creak of the floorboards as Stephen shifted his weight. He turned the photograph over in his hands, studying it intently, as if trying to decipher the unspoken truths hidden within its frame. For so many years, he'd thought of his grandmother as a distant, almost mythical figure, a woman who lived quietly and left little trace of herself behind. Now, standing here in this dusty storeroom, he realized how little he truly knew about her. Ellie broke the silence, her voice gentle but probing. Do you think she ever regretted leaving him behind? Or he left her? Stephen shook his head, frustration etched across his face. I don't know. She never said anything about love or relationships from that time. All I know is that she came home, married my grandfather, and raised a family. That's all anyone ever told me. Ellie nodded slowly, her thoughts turning inward. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, binding them together in a shared sense of wonder and uncertainty. She couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with Stephen now, a recognition that their families' histories were intertwined in ways neither of them had anticipated. Whatever happened between them, Ellie said finally, her voice steady, it shaped both of our lives in ways we can't fully understand. Your grandmother saved my father's life. That's not something I take lightly. Stephen met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. And now you're helping me, he replied, his tone edged with irony. Feels like the universe has a weird sense of humor. Ellie smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Or maybe it's just giving us a chance to make sense of the past, to honor the people who came before us. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the storeroom wrapping around them like a cocoon. Then Ellie straightened, gesturing toward the pile of damaged antiques waiting to be restored. Come on, she said, her tone lightening. Let's get started. You've got skills, right? Show me what you can do. Stephen hesitated, glancing once more at the photograph before setting it down gently on a nearby shelf. As he followed Ellie back into the main part of the shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that the pocket watch still resting on the counter held more answers than either of them could yet imagine. The next morning, Stephen arrived at Grant's Antiques with a new sense of purpose. The storeroom had been transformed into a makeshift workshop, its cluttered shelves pushed aside to make room for tools and half-finished projects. Ellie was already there, arranging supplies on a long wooden table that groaned under the weight of tarnished candlesticks, chipped porcelain figurines, and a rusted music box whose melody had long since faded. Good morning, she greeted him warmly, glancing up from her work. I've set aside a few pieces I think you'll enjoy working on. Nothing overwhelming, just enough to ease you into it. Take your time. We're not in a rush. Stephen nodded, setting down his bag near the table. He glanced around the space, taking in the organized chaos. It reminded him of his father's garage back home, the same mix of precision and patience required to coax beauty from broken things. Ellie handed him a small wooden frame, its surface marred by water damage and peeling varnish. This one's been sitting here for years. Fix it up if you can. Without another word, Stephen got to work. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as he sanded away the rough edges and carefully applied a fresh coat of sealant. Hours passed unnoticed, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper and soft clink of tools filling the silence between them. Occasionally, Ellie would pause to watch him, impressed by the ease with which he handled even the most delicate tasks. You're good at this, she remarked eventually, leaning against the doorway with a cup of coffee in hand. Did your father teach you? Skills like these are passed down through generations, aren't they? He did, Stephen replied, not looking up from his work. He used to restore furniture for a living. Said it was about more than just fixing. It was about giving something a second chance. Ellie smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the pocket watch still sitting on the counter. Sounds like sound advice. Your father was a wise man. They worked side by side for the rest of the day, exchanging fragments of stories as they repaired objects that seemed to carry whispers of their own histories. Ellie told him about her father's obsession with preserving the past, how he'd spent his life collecting relics from wars and forgotten eras. In return, Stephen shared glimpses of his childhood, how his grandmother would sit by the window in the evenings, staring out at the horizon as though searching for something she'd lost. She never talked much about the war, Stephen admitted, pausing to examine a newly polished silver tray. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear her humming old songs. Songs I didn't recognize until I joined the army myself. Ellie tilted her head, intrigued. What kind of songs? Hymns mostly, and ballads from the 40s. Stuff soldiers used to sing to keep morale up. He hesitated, then added quietly, I think she missed it in a way. Not the fighting, obviously, but the camaraderie, the sense of belonging. Ellie nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. My dad used to say the same thing. He always described the war as this strange mix of horror and humanity, like the worst moments brought out the best in people. Their conversation drifted naturally to the photograph they'd discovered the day before. Ellie pulled it out again, studying it intently as she spoke. You know, I've been thinking about what you said, that your grandmother never mentioned my father after the war. Maybe it wasn't because she didn't care. Maybe it was because it hurt too much. Stephen frowned, setting down his tools. You think they loved each other? I don't know, Ellie admitted. But look at the way they're positioned in the photo. There's intimacy there, subtle but undeniable. And those initials on the watch, 4AB, Love HG. That has to mean something, doesn't it? Stephen exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. If they did have feelings for each other, it must have ended when the war did. She came home, married my grandfather, and lived a quiet life. No letters, no visits, nothing. Ellie's eyes softened, sympathy mingling with determination. Maybe that's why I feel like I owe you something. Your grandmother saved my father's life. If she gave up part of herself to do that, then the least I can do is help you now. Stephen opened his mouth to protest, but Ellie cut him off with a firm shake of her head. Don't argue with me on this. You're doing great work here, and honestly, I could use the help. Consider it repayment for everything she did. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Stephen looked at her for a long moment, seeing not just the shop owner who'd taken a chance on him, but someone who understood the weight of legacy and loss. Finally, he nodded, accepting her offer with a quiet gratitude that needed no words. As the days passed, their partnership deepened. Stephen threw himself into the restoration work, finding solace in the act of creating order from chaos. Each repaired object felt like a step toward reclaiming a piece of himself, a reminder that even the most damaged things could be made whole again. Ellie, meanwhile, began to see him not just as a struggling veteran, but as a man burdened by secrets he wasn't ready to share. One afternoon, as they worked together in companionable silence, Ellie finally broached the subject of the pocket watch. It had remained untouched on the counter, a silent witness to their growing bond. You know, she said casually, if you ever decide to sell it, I'd buy it, but only because I think it deserves to stay somewhere meaningful. Stephen paused, his hands hovering over a delicate music box he'd been repairing. Meaningful how? It's history, Ellie replied simply. Your grandmother's history, my father's history, ours in a way. I'd keep it safe, not as a relic, but as a reminder of the connections we don't always see coming. Stephen stared at the watch, its engravings catching the light. For so long, it had represented nothing more than desperation, a means to an end. Now, it felt like something else entirely, a bridge between past and present, a symbol of lives intertwined across generations. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice softer than usual. Thanks, Ellie. She smiled, returning to her work without pressing further. As they continued side by side, the shop filled with the steady hum of progress and possibility. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for now, they were content to rebuild, to honor the legacies left behind while forging new paths forward. In the following weeks, Grant's Antiques became more than just a place of work for Stephen. The storeroom, once cluttered with forgotten relics, now hummed with life as objects long neglected began to shine anew under his careful hands. Each piece he restored carried its own story, but none resonated with him quite like the pocket watch still resting silently on Ellie's counter. It had become a fixture in the shop, a quiet reminder of the bond that tied them together, a bond neither fully understood yet both cherished. Ellie noticed the change in Stephen over time. His posture softened. The rigid tension that had defined him when he first walked into the shop began to fade. He laughed more often now, though it was always tinged with a lingering melancholy. She could see him wrestling with something deep inside, something he hadn't yet found the words to express. But she didn't push him. Instead, she let their shared work speak for itself, trusting that time would reveal what needed to be said. One crisp autumn morning, as golden sunlight streamed through the shop windows, Ellie approached Stephen with a thoughtful expression. "This grandfather clock has been here since before my father passed," she explained, brushing dust from its casing. "He always meant to fix it, but life got in the way. I think it's time someone finally gave it a second chance." Its face bore the marks of age, and its pendulum hung motionless, frozen in time. Stephen nodded, running his fingers lightly over the carved wood. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "I'll do my best." As he worked on the clock over the following days, he found himself reflecting on the parallels between the object and his own journey. Like the clock, he'd been stuck, trapped in a cycle of survival without purpose. But now, surrounded by fragments of history and guided by the steady rhythm of restoration, he felt something akin to movement again. Not perfect, not complete, but progress nonetheless. Ellie watched him with quiet admiration, noticing how his focus seemed to ground him. Yet there were moments when she caught him staring at the pocket watch, his expression unreadable. One evening, as they tidied up the shop before closing, she finally addressed it. "You've never asked me to buy it," she said softly, nodding toward the watch. "Why?" Stephen hesitated, setting down the cloth he'd been using to polish a brass candlestick. "I guess I'm not ready to let go of it yet. It's not just mine, it belongs to her, to my grandmother. Selling it feels like saying goodbye, and I don't know if I'm ready for that." Ellie nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you think she'd want you to hold onto it forever? Or would she want you to find a way to honor her memory instead?" Her question lingered in the air, unspoken truths hanging between them. Stephen turned the idea over in his mind, considering the weight of legacy and the burden of carrying it alone. For so long, he'd seen the watch as a relic of loss, a symbol of everything his grandmother had endured and sacrificed. But perhaps it was also a bridge, a connection to the people who came after her, including him. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice rough with emotion. "What if honoring her means finding a new home for it? Somewhere meaningful?" Ellie smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "If you ever decide to sell it, you know where it belongs." The next day, Stephen arrived at the shop earlier than usual, carrying the velvet pouch once more. This time, however, his steps were lighter, his shoulders less burdened. When Ellie looked up from arranging a display case, she saw him standing by the counter, the pocket watch cradled in his hands. "I've thought about what you said," he began, his tone measured but firm. "About honoring her memory. I think this is the right thing to do." Ellie's breath caught as he placed the watch gently on the counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up, examining it once more. The engravings glinted in the morning light, their meaning clearer now than ever before. "For A.B. Love H.G.," she whispered, tracing the letters with her thumb. "It's beautiful, Stephen. Are you sure?" He nodded, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Yeah, it's not goodbye, it's letting go. In a way, I think she'd approve." Ellie set the watch down carefully, then reached out to squeeze his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion, "for trusting me with this." One afternoon, as they sat together amidst the organized chaos of the storeroom, Ellie pulled out the photograph of Henry and Amelia once more. She studied it quietly, her fingers brushing over the faded image. They must have loved each other, she mused aloud. Even if it was brief, even if it ended, they loved each other. Stephen glanced at the photo, his expression softening. Maybe that's enough, he replied. To have loved, even for a moment, to have mattered to someone. Ellie nodded, her gaze drifting to the pocket watch now displayed prominently in a glass case near the register. It wasn't just an antique anymore. It was a testament to the power of connection, of lives intertwined across generations. And in its presence, Stephen felt a newfound sense of belonging to the future he was slowly rebuilding. He felt whole. This story reminds us that even the smallest choices can ripple through generations. Do you think Stephen made the right decision keeping the watch? And how would you honor a legacy left behind? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more unforgettable tales.